Okay, class. In this podcast, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the rise of the Soviet Union. Again, the Bolsheviks had taken power in Moscow in 1917. They promised the Russian people bread, land, and peace. They gained peace with Germany by signing this very punishing treaty to so they have a separate, the Soviets, Russia and Germany make a separate peace, but that's signed in March of 18, but by November of 18, Germany surrendered. So the treaty's negated. Lenin, as I talked in the last podcast, it shows kind of the calculating nature of the Bolsheviks. He took a calculated risk. He signed a treaty, made peace with the Germans, but then the Germans surrender and the Soviet Union is able to recapture a lot of the land it had surrendered in the treaty it signed in March of 1918. I want to make a point that maybe is forgotten among students of today, is that ultimately, by the early 1920s, the first Marxist state, the first communist state, the Soviet Union, consists of 15 republics. 15 republics. And one republic such as Georgia, not the state of Georgia. Georgia is a republic in the Soviet Union. Kazakhstan, Lithuania, Moldavia. I'm not going to test you on all this. But what I want to make a point is that's why it's called the Soviet Union. It's the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. It's made up of a number of nationalities that in 2022 are for the most part, independent nations. The Soviet Union exploded in the 1980s and 1990s, and this grouping of republics, for the most part, gained independence. Okay, so when I was in college, the Soviet Union was this one gigantic. Think of it as an empire that fell apart in the 1980s and 1990s. And part of what Putin's trying to do, in part, is he sees the collapse of the Soviet Union as a great tragedy. And he's trying to redress some of the collapse of the Soviet Union. He's trying to draw back into Russia nations, certainly such as Ukraine. And a lot of people think Ukraine would be the first step. So it's important to know about the Soviet Union to understand Putin, that he sees the Soviet Union as a very positive force in history, that its defeat was a disaster, was a tragedy, that many of the countries that were part of the Soviet Union that I just considered part of Russia when I was your age, or when I was in college anyway, now are independent nations such as Lithuania, Estonia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, above all, Ukraine. And he's trying to recreate a kind of a second act of the Soviet Empire. And so, as I said before, Ukraine is a bit of a bouncing ball. It's Russian, it's German for about 8 months. It gains its independence very briefly after World War II. But by 1922, 1923, Moscow has gotten control of Ukraine and claims sovereignty over Ukraine. Ukraine is not an independent nation. It is part of the larger Soviet Union, and it is ruled by the communist government from Moscow. So what you had is, after the Bolsheviks took over in 1917, and again, this is background, so you can put down your pen. I'm not going to test you on this, but I just want you to have the background. What happened after the Bolsheviks took over, there was a civil war in Russia between anti-communist Russians, the so-called White Army, and the Bolshevik army, and the Bolsheviks win. And what a lot of us have forgotten, but the Russians have never forgotten, is that the US, Great Britain especially, helped the anti-communist fight, the communists during this Russian Civil War. We actually sent in troops into the Soviet Union after World War I, and this is something that the Russians have never forgotten. By the way, this is an obvious point, but I'll make it anyway. Russians are also one of the nationalities in the Soviet Union. They're the largest nationalities. But like I say, I used to think everyone was Russian. Now I realize that it's a separate nation. It's the largest nation. Now, of course, it's a separate country. But it's one of the 15 nationalities that made up the Soviet Union. Okay, so back to the post-war period. By the 1920s, the Soviet government has established control. And in the Soviet Union, it has folded these 15 republics into the Soviet Union, including Ukraine. But the Soviets didn't get everything that they wanted. The communists didn't get everything that they wanted in the post-war period. Above all, the Soviet Union didn't get as much of Poland as it wanted. The Soviet Union thought, the Soviet government, Lenin, Stalin, Trotsky, that crowd, they thought that their takeover in Russia or the Soviet Union would be the beginning of a worldwide revolution, where workers all over the world would revolt against capitalist government and would install communist government. So in the United States, in Germany, it came pretty close to happening, actually. You did have left-wing revolts in Germany that were put down very forcefully. A lot of communist and leftist leaders were murdered in Germany. So there was great, great unrest in Europe after World War I. And the folks that ruled Moscow, the Bolsheviks in Moscow, thought, this is great. This is the beginning of the worldwide revolution. Well, it didn't work out that way. The capitalists managed to regain control over all the societies where there was unrest, Germany, even in the US. And it turned out that the Soviet Union was pretty much left on its own as the only, at the time anyway, as the only communist government. And this is where Stalin talks about socialism later on in one country. What Stalin realizes is he can't export revolution. What he's going to have to do is create the workers' paradise, which is the promise of communism, that there'd be a workers' paradise created in which workers would only work as little as possible just to keep the society going, that life would become better, that the industrial sector would dominate the agricultural sector, that there would be a utopia, a workers' utopia created. This is what communists thought. They thought that history was moving in one direction, towards the proletariat, towards the utopia of the workers, where they controlled all the levers of power. You had a lot more leisure. Workers ran the state and everything. There'd be so much production that everyone would have a good life. There'd be equality, but there'd be a high standard of living. Inequality would be gone. This is the promise of the Soviet Union. Of course, when Stalin comes in, it becomes a dictatorship. But this is kind of the promise that Lenin and later Stalin made, that if you stick with us, there'll be this workers' paradise created in the Soviet Union. So this is the basis of the legitimacy of the communist government. And of course, what it turned out to be a dictatorship, a murderous. You had a secret police that would come and arrest, torture, murder its opponents. And in the name of this workers' paradise, tens of millions died in the Soviet Union. Okay, so big story. The Soviet Union, the leaders of the Soviet Union, after World War I, they think that they're at the vanguard of a worldwide revolution. It doesn't happen. And they're forced to look inward to create a socialist state. Now, I want to talk about Poland now, and you will be quizzed on this and pay attention to this. So the Soviets were very unhappy with the borders of Poland. Uh, the Soviet army had actually invaded Poland in the period after World War One. It had gone into Poland, it had invaded Poland, and it had tried to capture Poland in the post-World War One period. 1919, but in the early 1920s, Poland and the USSR signed a peace treaty. It's called the Treaty of Riga, RIGA, the Treaty of Riga. It's signed in the early 1920s, and Poland and the Soviet Union make peace. The Polish army was able to turn back the Soviet army, which was overstretched by this time because it had fought a civil war and it was just chaos in the Soviet Union. And Lenin, who will die very quickly, he just decides he can't go to war with everybody anymore. He's got to make peace with the Poles because he's got to focus on maintaining power in these 15 republics that have become the Soviet Union. So once again, the very pragmatic Lenin makes peace with Poland. Now, this is going to have huge repercussions for our course because the borders of the Soviet Union, if you look at the map that I have in front of you or that I posted, Poland borders, what does Poland border on? It borders on, ding, ding, Ukraine, Belarus. And so again, here really is the absolute center of what Snyder calls the bloodlands, Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine. Now it extends beyond those three areas, but this is kind of the very, very center of it. So the Soviets were very unhappy about the borders that it signed the treaty, but the Soviet government was unhappy with the treaty. A number of Ukrainians became now Poles. So the Soviet Union lost some of Ukraine to Poland. So there were Ukrainians now, ethnic Ukrainians, folks that spoke Russian and Ukrainian, who now are living under the Polish flag. And Stalin, especially when he gains power in the mid to late 1920s, he's extremely paranoid about Poland. Poland is a big deal. It weighs very heavily in his mind. And as you'll see in the Snyder book, Stalin ends up executing a number of ethnic Poles that ended up in the Soviet Union. So what happened is with the signing of this border, the Treaty of Riga, the signing of this treaty and the creation of the border with Poland, you had a group of Ukrainians end up in Poland, but you also have some Poles ending up in the Soviet Union. And initially, some of these Poles worked with the Soviet government, but Stalin's so paranoid that he's convinced that Poland wants to take out the Soviet government. It wants to defeat, it wants to undermine the Soviet government. He sees Poland in the late 1920s, early 1930s, he sees Poland as far more of an enemy than he sees Germany as an enemy. And as you'll see when you read the Snyder book, he ends up killing well over 100,000 ethnic Poles, especially in the 1930s, because he's so paranoid of the Poles. He's so paranoid of Poland. He's so afraid of Poland. Now, the Treaty of Riga is signed, and then in the 1930s, Poland and the Soviet Union sign a non-aggression pact because Poland is just not strong enough to confront the Soviet Union. But it doesn't really matter. What you have to realize about Stalin, he's super paranoid. I mean, I wish he's beyond paranoid. He saw enemies everywhere. And so look at this map and note that Poland is a thorn in Stalin's side. Beginning with the signing of the Treaty of Riga in the early 1920s, where the Soviets had tried to go in and capture Poland, but had been defeated. And with the signing of this treaty, the Russians signed it, but they weren't happy about it because the eastern border of Poland went into Ukraine, and you had some Ukrainians becoming Poles. But also, Poland it wasn't a clean border before World War I. So you also had Poles that lived in Ukraine who were ethnic Poles. And what do I mean by ethnic Poles? Language, religion, Roman Catholicism versus Greek Orthodox or Russian Orthodox, certain cultural customs, identification with as being Polish. Like today, we have Italian Americans, right? Polish Americans, but of course, it's even stronger in Europe. So here's the take-home point: the eastern border of Poland, that's created in 1922, is a big sticking point with the Soviet Union. They're not very happy with how it came down, and it's going to be a source of tension with Stalin. He's going to execute a lot of Poles. He's totally paranoid that Poland is out to get him. And again, note the geography here: Poland, Ukraine, Belarus. This is right at the center, although it's not all of the bloodlands. It's kind of the heart of the bloodlands that Schneider's talking about.